Mhm.
Ugh, what is that?
What's what?
Why do you keep saying like that?
Mhm.
Ah, stop. You sound like Yoshi.
Yoshi.
Yeah.
Yoshi.
Yeah, there it is. That's the exact thing. That's the exact same thing. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast. This is a show where... nope, I just did the wrong intro. I'm doing resin roleplay.
This is a show where... Wait a minute.
I'm stuck. I'm doing two shows at the same time, and this never happens. We have 2 uploads a week. I don't need to write anything down. I'm a professional.
That's the opposite of a professional.
Hello, everyone. This is Raphael.
I'm Loryn.
We're the Pacheco siblings, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast, a talk show in which 2 siblings converse about anything and everything.
Hey, Raph.
Yeah?
What's the nerd version of stolen valor?
I have no idea. I feel like there should be a word for that, but I don't know what it is.
There's gotta be one, right? There's definitely... I remember this was the biggest thing in high school, right? Especially like amongst like particular subculture groups where it's just like, posers.
Oh yeah, I remember posers.
Yeah, like posers of like particular subculture groups, like, like you're a poser, like you're not a real goth or whatever.
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
a poser.
You're not a real subculture person.
Yeah, whatever that means. But, like, what's the nerd version of like? Is it still poser? Is it like because stolen valor for nerd stuff?
I think so. Well, I feel like poser is specifically those kinds of sort of fashion and music based subcultures.
Yeah.
I feel like stolen valor is specific to military based subcultures. I don't know what the nerd based subculture one would be. I feel like it needs its own particular term. There's definitely some reference somewhere, some nerdy reference that totally exemplifies it, but I'm just not sure which one it would be.
Yeah, because right before we started recording, not right before, because we talked about a lot of stuff before we recorded. We were talking about how I haven't shown Raph our con pictures up from the con we were talking about in one of our previous episodes.
Yeah, super.
Like, as far as I know, you didn't even go to a con. And I was like, maybe I didn't.
Yeah. Stolen valor is a very fascinating thing, though.
It really is, and people do it just all the time.
Like, all the time.
Like obviously there's the recognition of being perceived as a hero, right? It's like, oh yeah, I served in the war. It's like, did you though? That's an entire thing. Like that is both like legally and culturally problematic, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously you can't claim like veteran status. That comes with particular legal benefits.
Mm-hmm.
But as well as culturally, you can't like take that away from people who actually were in like very, very stressful, dangerous, important jobs. It's just like I get why people would want to do that for that kind of recognition, but then there's like stolen valor for some basic stuff, like just real dumb stuff. Like I'm sure there's somebody somewhere who's just who claims just up and down to anybody that they were like they were the star player on their high school football team, right? And they were just nowhere near it. There was somebody somewhere doing that, and it's the weirdest kind of stolen valor. There's probably somebody who's like, yeah, I'm a con goer and has never been to a con.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just wants the prestige, the perceived prestige.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting thing too, is they actually, I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's still going. The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, they actually have been doing bonus episodes. That series ended a while ago officially, but they've been doing bonus episodes of little afterthoughts as well as some like follow-up interviews and stuff. But they had
I'm
one.
Sure that, like, I'm sure like after that podcast came out, a bunch of people were like probably coming forth and being like, oh yeah, like now it's more public. I could talk about this a little bit more openly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now I didn't know that you guys are doing this and you didn't interview me. So
there's been a little bit of that, I'm sure. But yeah, there's also been some people that they were trying to get for the entirety of the duration that didn't decide to agreed to an interview until now, but they're
exactly,
just also just like afterthought stuff from the writer and host, and but as well as also some like retractions too, which is actually pretty interesting. They made some modifications to the earlier episodes based on a complaint that one of the survivors had, and so
that's good.
Yeah, that was actually really cool. I was surprised that they did that. But on one of these bonus episodes, Mike Cosper, the host, he actually talks about stolen valor, and well, it's part of a larger conversation about institutions in general. And it's interesting. Right. I don't know about you, but there are a lot of thinkers in the evangelical world right now that are thinking deeply about this idea of institutions, especially because there's a lot of disillusionment going on right now about institutions. And it's like, what is that? What does that mean? What do we stand for? What is the purpose of institutions to begin with? And he talks about stolen valor and how basically, and there's a lot of people, obviously a lot of military people recognize stolen valor when they see it and are always keen to call it out when they find it. Yeah. And he talks about, if you like search on YouTube, you can find a lot of videos of this happening like on the streets and stuff. And like people getting publicly called out by actual veterans for their stolen valor. And what he points out though is that like that is an example of like good gatekeeping that institutions should do. Right. Because that's essentially what it is. It's self-enforcing to ensure that you know whether somebody is who they say they are. And it's the culture itself that enforces it.
Yeah. Self-policing. But that's one of those things as well when it comes to gatekeeping as a term, as an umbrella term, that somehow like gatekeeping is all bad. Right. But that's not necessarily true. Like there is good gatekeeping and there is good like. For example, it's like the idea of gatekeeping of just keeping a certain group of people out, right? If that's used to like reinforce like cultural identity politics stuff like that, like that's obviously bad. If like this is like a particular group of people for an arbitrary reason, that kind of gatekeeping is bad. But gatekeeping in general is used all the time. You don't want a certain kind of people to like own firearms, right? That is also gatekeeping. But you don't want a certain kind of people, like you were just saying, like you don't want people who didn't serve in the military to be able to have the benefits of having served in the military. Yeah, that is technically also gatekeeping. Like there is a lot of self-policing that the veteran community does that like is inherently gatekeeping,
and it's good gatekeeping. Like we want that kind of gatekeeping.
Everything exists on a spectrum.
There's pros and
cons.
Hypercube drinking game.
Back to spectrum every time.
Back to spectrums.
Take a drink every time you mention a spectrum. But like like there's toxic and then there's like I don't know, what's the opposite of toxic? Productive or
healthy? Positive, healthy.
Positive, sides to pretty much everything.
Well, it's like you always say,
everything.
Moderation too, right?
Yeah.
Everything in moderation.
Like it goes back to that thing I always say, which is the difference between poison and medicine is dosage. Too much of anything can always, become toxic. If you are overly biased in your gatekeeping, it's going to become toxic. But you're everybody wants to moderate. That's just good. You don't want unmoderated anything.
Yeah. Fair.
I was trying to think of a list of things. I was like, oh wow, like all of that would be bad. If there was moderation. All of it would be bad.
Yeah. That's what was kind of hilarious. Did you see Hank Green's video that he did on Vlogbrothers on Elon Musk after the whole Twitter debacle, and how
I did not. Yeah, I did not see it, but I saw it.
It's interesting. Well, because obviously Hank thinks a lot about Twitter. It's a problem.
He does. He has an unhealthy obsession with Twitter.
He does kind of have an unhealthy obsession with Twitter.
I think just in social media platforms in general, because he just like thinks about how he interacts with his environment a lot. And I think Twitter is just the most direct social media experiment that you can point to and be like, this is the most distilled, pure version of social media content that you can get.
Yeah, that's fair. But yeah, it was talking about that as well. Like, Elon Musk was talking about buying Twitter for the sake of like lessening the moderation on it. And
Right.
Hank Green was talking about, it's like, well, that's not really, there are reasons why that's not really a viable solution to anything. That's not really something you want to do. And sure enough, like several weeks after making that decision to buy the whole thing up, he literally shows a clip in that video of him reversing his position and saying like, well, actually, we are going to still have some moderation. He's like, it took him 3 weeks to realize what I could have told him right off the bat. It's like, yeah, that's really true. But that's the thing. Moderation is always a necessity. And as you keenly point out with your illustration of medicine and poison, right? It's dosage. Just too much of a good thing, an unmoderated amount of any good thing can become essentially toxic or lethal or poisonous.
Literally toxic.
We need water to live, but it could also drown you.
Mm-hmm. Did you know that you can drown by drinking too much water? Kind of. It's not technically drowning.
That sounds awful.
Yeah. So you know what happens when you drink water? Your cells get hydrated and there's a thing called osmosis where water transfers between your cell walls depending on like salination levels, so on and so forth. The point is, if you drink a ton of water, like literally gallons at a time, your cells take in so much water that they explode.
Ugh.
Yeah.
That's not good.
It was a big problem. It was a big problem back in the day. I remember, I think it was in colleges in like the early 2000s, something happened where there was a hazing ritual where a bunch of students were forced, like freshman students were forced to drink like a ton of water. They're like, oh yeah, this is safe, right? It's water. It's literally water. We're just gonna like, we can't make you drink milk because you throw up. Or we can't do alcohol because there's alcohol poisoning. We'll make them drink like a gallon or so of water. And they did, and these kids died because their cells exploded, like their vessels, like I don't know exactly the method of death other than like organ failure, but they drank so much water that their cells took in so much and they exploded, and these kids died as a result of it. Water isn't safe, even if you think you're consuming it in a safe way. Everything is toxic in some way or another. Like it's hard to think about it because we have this civilization constructed around keeping us as safe as possible, and we're basically like living all in we're not literally living in like bubble boy land, but like civilization is a kind of insulation against the threats of nature. Literally everything is trying to kill you. You have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's fair. Wow, I didn't know that though. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, and literally everything, including water. Water's good for you,
including water.
It's not even like if you jump into it, you'll die. If you drink too much of that stuff, you'll die too.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say like even okay, let me do what I do and bring this back to theological application. So
take another shot.
I was going to say like, because like in Christian theology, God is the ultimate good. And I was like, well, okay, then I guess there is one good that is not entirely lethal to overexposure. Yeah, but no, then I realized that's incorrect, because at least in our current forms, in our fallen nature, and there, of course, our destiny is to be in a new nature and new bodies that are capable of handling this. But as it is now, that is very explicitly the case, according to Scripture, that being exposed to God in all of His goodness right now would kill us, like literally outright kill us. Yeah, instantaneously. Yeah, so it's like, yeah, I guess that's the thing. It's just like all too much of good things will kill us.
well, that's the. Okay, now I'm going to bring this back into philosophical kind of. Just when it comes to the state that we're in, right? The current forms that we inhabit, this mortal, frail frames that we have, that we all inhabit, right? Mm-hmm. These bodies that our minds inhabit. They're inherently extremely, extremely frail. Like the current forms that we inhabit are they're flawed, they're imperfect, they're subject to disease and sickness and all this other stuff. And then like look at any culture who has an idea of like ascension or transcendence or anything like that, right? It's always like it removes the qualities of mortality. Obviously, there's the becoming immortal in whichever form of heaven that different cultures will kind of have as an afterlife. But even so, whatever that goodness is, there is always an aspect of wherever it is you're going to, like, in the afterlife or in whatever kind of transcendent form that you might take, whatever that is overpowering for whatever your current body currently is. Like you have to be destroyed first. So even that good stuff is inherently destructive in nature, because you cannot remain mortal and have that inherent or have that pure good, whatever it is. It is inherently destructive.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's very much the case, because our current forms just cannot handle
Can't handle it.
They can't handle it. They can't handle it. I'm always listening to the Bible Project podcast, and they've been doing an interesting thing this year, which I actually think is really cool for a podcast, is because last year they did this thing where they defined their paradigm. I think I was telling you about that when that happened. That was a really interesting series.
We still need to do that.
Yeah, we should do some paradigm defining on here as well, for sure. But they talked about their paradigm for reading the Bible. And what they're doing this year is they actually dedicated this entire year to show how they exercise that paradigm in reading the Bible. And what they're doing is week by week, they're reading through the entire Torah, all 5 books, or the Pentateuch, as we call it in the Christian tradition. But the Torah and the Pentateuch, same thing. They're reading through the entire Torah and just going through that in its entirety and applying their principles. And it's super cool. But yeah, he talks about that. And that's a framework that I actually hadn't understood the wilderness narrative through, that you find in the Torah, which is, the point between Israel arriving at the promised land and after they've left Egypt. So it's after they've left Egypt, before they arrive in the promised land, that area in the wilderness is, because like I've always thought of that as being a time of like, I mean, there's those elements of like rebellion and like, all of them, they just become just very I suppose difficult and disobedient people in all of the difficulties of the wilderness. But there's also this element of the fact of the fire being there and like God dwelling among them being like a powerful thing, but also a dangerous thing. And Tim Mackey kind of emphasizes that, where it's just like it's inherently dangerous. And it can literally kill you if you get too close, or if you defile the Holy of Holies and all of that. So it's like inherently dangerous. Yeah, but
everything's a spectrum.
Yeah, so it's like too much of a good thing will just be overpowering.
Always.
Let me circle back.
Every single time
without fail. Like we haven't figured an exception yet. At least in this world, with the rules of the world as we now know it.
Yeah, like even things that are inherently good will kill you. That is why smite is a broken spell in D&D.
Divine smite, as in?
Yeah.
Yeah, hit them with that divine smite and just be like, pow, holiness.
Look at that. I literally added more dice to my damage. That's how good this is. It's goodness. I'm hitting you with raw pureness.
Yeah.
The power of my beliefs. It does 2d6 damage.
2d8, actually.
2d8 damage.
It does more if you're evil, though.
That's because of that the passion that the evil people bring to their. That's what I call just being a dick. Being passionate.
Yeah. Well, you have to be incarnately evil, essentially, for that to be to get that extra damage, because you have to be either, I think, an undead or a fiend. And, that's pretty bad. You could be a jerk, or you could be an undead or a fiend, Oh, man. You need to watch Calamity, man. So I need to... There's a fascinating paladin character in there, but...
The one with I was going to say Robo Sword, a Holy Avenger.
Yeah, he has a Holy Avenger. I think I told you that much. But you told me beforehand that you haven't seen it yet. We're going to have to delay doing the spoiler cast on it on here. I still want to do that. I was kind of hoping to make a lessons from calamity video for my personal channel that is a condensed version of our conversation on here. Kind of pull a Bible project, myself in that regard. But I'm
That's
afraid
a really good
I think
idea for content.
Yeah, but like I think the relevance window is kind of fading, so I might just do that video on its own. I don't know, because definitely I feel like we got a bit of an extension by virtue of the fact that they did several roundtables afterwards.
Mhm.
But I think by the time we record another podcast, that I think that window will definitely be passed. So we'll see. If I can find the time, I might try and squeeze that video in there. Although I'm realizing because my time has been so limited nowadays and I've got such massive projects that I've been working on, and in addition to a full-time job, I feel like I need to streamline my video creation process a little bit.
Definitely.
Because there's definitely a lot of stuff that I need to do that aren't important. I suppose that means that I want to do them, not need to do them.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a lot of stuff that I want to do that I just don't have time for. Which means if I'm going to do them, I'm going to have to do them in a very, how should I say, extemporaneous kind of way with a lot less preparation than I would want to do, which I'm sure is fine too. I'll just have to settle.
Yeah. You have to accumulate enough stuff that you can make time for all these things that you want to do and just set aside some time, one bit of time for a bunch of these little projects.
Yeah, do like who's that person you watch? Bo the Fifth Column, you say, who does like a bunch of videos at the same time.
Yeah.
Just batch record.
He's like, he recently did a video where he's like, I get a lot of these questions or comments or whatever. It's just like that aren't worth a whole video on their own, but altogether, all equal in one video. And it's I think actually I've seen that content style a couple different ways now in a bunch of different like artist spheres. Like there was one.
What, batch recording?
Yeah,
like I'm going to do several videos in one sitting.
Yeah. Like batch projects, because I Did a Thing is another YouTuber that I follow who's a really like maker. like they're good makers, and there's I Did a Thing. I think he did one where it's just like a bunch of his like a bunch of dumb projects all in one that like just aren't worth the video, like a bunch of dumb suggestions, like making a treadmill with sandpaper. Or like replacing a treadmill with sandpaper. It's like that's literally just like I do it and then I figure out if it's dumb. Yeah, it was dumb. Moving on. Yeah. One idea on its own, not worth a whole day, but 10 ideas equal a whole day of recording. So you might have to do that. You might have to accumulate a bunch of those together and then end up doing just like a weekend to record all of them. Yeah,
but where am I going to get a weekend to record all of them, though?
I don't know. Next year?
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
You never know. It might. You might just a weekend might fall in your lap.
I would sure like that. Well, hold on. Let me circle back to something before we get too far off the beaten path, because I didn't complete my thought earlier when I was talking about the rise and fall of Mars Hill and gatekeeping and stolen valor. So, well, just to bring it to his point, though, the application that Mike Cosper used with regard to stolen valor and how he said that was a good version of gatekeeping of how institutions should function in that way. And he was just talking about how the way that applied to Mars Hill was just the fact that he feels like there's a certain element of that with certain kinds of pastors as well, where it's almost like a form of stolen valor where you want the social capital it gives you without actually having done the thing to build that trust and to be a trustworthy person. Because it's like that is a social position that automatically puts you in an elevated position of trust. And then if you haven't done the earning of that trust or built the character to be able to sustain it, then you could end up abusing that trust that people want to give to your institutional role. Yeah.
I think that's mostly the problem when it comes to institutions and people falling out of trust with various institutions is the fact that a lot of institutions have become a shortcut to trust, where people just like, okay, instead of building myself up as a person of trust and then having that be solidified within an institution, I'm going to use this institution as a method of acquiring trust. It's backwards, right? and then therefore
it's a means to an
people
end.
then therefore people shortcut basically just becoming a better person by taking advantage of these things. And then we now have these institutions that are chock full of people who haven't put in the character work to be trusted.
Yeah. And I don't know how much I've talked about this on the podcast, but I know we have in our own conversations, which is character development, I guess we could call it, is something that I've always that I've been increasingly fascinated with the older I get, because there's not, to my knowledge, a hard science about it, right? There is no characterology. But
you say that.
Is there?
You say that, but then there are entire groups of psychopaths who do nothing but develop character.
This is fair, but you understand my point, though, right?
I totally get it.
It isn't a field of study, and yet it is something that I find you can study, and that you can develop, and that you can nurture, and that you can find a way to discern and understand it. But it's something that requires active intention. And again, the older I've gotten, the more fascinated I've been with this idea of character, because I guess the more essential I've understood it to be, right? It's not just like, because it's like, it's ephemeral, I think, is what fascinates me about it, right? It's because it's not a hard science, you can't really put your finger on what strong character is, and yet everybody recognizes it when they see it.
Yeah. And the problem is it's also it is a social construct where the definition of strong character differs between communities and between different cultures, where obviously there are certain traits that are universally valued, but then there are certain traits within specific cultures that are required to have strong character that aren't necessarily universal between different cultures, right?
Sure.
I can think of a couple of examples, but not off the top of my head. But there's strong character it's not something that, I think what I'm trying to say is, it's not entirely universal, and therefore it's hard to define one like curriculum to develop strong character. It's really it takes a lot of introspection and like study of like the environment that you live in to say like, what are the traits that are valued that I need to be able to express and exhibit in a healthy manner.
Yeah, but let me push back on that a little bit, though, because at the same time, like you said, some traits, like there are some virtues that are universally valued. And I think, and this is just getting back, I guess, to the root of the moral argument, but that's another thing entirely to tie it back to theology, but we don't necessarily need to do that here. But this is a core fundamental part of the moral argument, is the fact that there are such a thing as universal values to some extent, right? The specifics will change from culture to culture as to how it manifests, but there are, and how it's expressed specifically. I think it's the expressions mainly that differ, but
exactly
the values themselves that underlie them, right? The virtues are what matter in the abstract. And I think those things that are universally valued are the things that ultimately define strong character. And of course, having a good idea and a good understanding of the culture in which you live is essential to understanding the expressions, again, of those values. But I think it's possible to cultivate those values in such a way that they are applicable in a wide variety of cultural circumstances. And I think it is those underlying universal parts that ultimately make strong character, because the expressions of it can vary drastically, like you said, from culture to culture, but also person to person as well. So it's less, again, like you said, for that reason, you can't really nail a curriculum to it. It just has to be something that is to a certain extent intuited, and it requires wisdom. I think wisdom is a very useful word here, because wisdom and intuition and just understanding how to express principles of character within your cultural context and within your own personality, right? In your specific way of manifesting it.
I think you're right. I think you got to the point that I was trying to get to a lot better. But you know, I just realized we're talking about
What are we talking about?
We're actually talking about teaching learning.
Okay, now we're getting kind of meta, but I understand what you mean.
Because when it comes to teaching somebody how to learn, there's only so much you can do. Obviously, teaching somebody to memorize things is way easier, and therefore there is curriculums for that. There is curriculums for memorizing times tables, which apparently was what you were supposed to do with times tables as a kid. I didn't know that. I didn't know you were supposed to memorize it. But like that's the way like a lot of education has gone, is just because it is very difficult, and sometimes I don't want to say impossible, but there are a lot of people who literally do not want to learn how to learn.
This is true. I've seen it happen in real time.
And it's just like, if you don't want to learn how to learn, you won't, just because of how it is. Like, I don't know how to explain it other than that. So it's like, it's really hard to explain, or rather, it's really hard to set like a curriculum and just like, all right, we're gonna do this and we're gonna teach you how to learn. It's like, just give me the answer. It's like, no. That's not the point. It's the exact same thing when it comes to learning character, when it comes to being a good person. It's just like, all right, so here's what we're going to do. It's like, but like, what are the things I have to do to be a good person? It doesn't really work like that.
Yeah. What are the list of things that I have to do? Well, It's like, well, that is a very, I guess, psychopathic way of approaching it, right? Is like almost like looking for the bullet point list of what constitutes being a good person versus how to do it principally.
Yeah, and you see that a lot in very kind of like toxic personality teaching videos, where it's like, here's how. Okay, I'm gonna pick on this one specific kind of video that I've seen, but it's like, here's how to get women to like you.
Oh,
those kind of videos, right?
Yeah,
it's literally bullet point lists of things to do at a bar or in a social situation to get women to like you. It's obviously aimed towards men, and it's just like, no, that is a very specific way to get a specific type of single individual to like a specific type of single personality type. That is not how to get all of one half of the population to like you. Because that is impossible.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is it all boils down to individuals. And again, learning principles over... This is a Hypercube drinking game. Here comes another one that we're going to talk about a lot, right? Principles versus techniques.
Spectrums, theology, philosophy.
Yeah, principles versus techniques. This is one we keep coming back to. I don't know if it's come up on the podcast yet, but if this is the first, then it's certainly the first of many. I'm sure it has, but I can't recall.
We probably talked about it like in passing, but never defining it.
Yeah, but principles versus technique. This is something we talk about a lot. And this is the core of learning, really. This is the core of learning about learning theory. Is principle versus technique. Because a lot of teaching, specifically you're talking earlier about what's essentially rote teaching, right? Rote memorization, memorizing bullet points, or teaching lists of things rather than the principles underlying those things. And if you do that, you could get people to know a lot of facts, but you can't get them to understand the why of why a lot of stuff happens, or why certain equations work certain ways, or why certain reactions happen, things like that. Yeah. You lose that with rote memorization. But on the broader spectrum, rote learning is endemic in a lot of teaching cultures. We talk especially about martial arts culture. Martial arts culture is full of rote learning. And generally speaking, this is where we get our terminology from. Martial arts culture has a long history of the teaching of technique over principle.
Yeah.
Right. And especially after its boom in popularity in the 70s and 80s, where you have a lot of McDojos here in the States and in Western culture in general, there was a huge explosion of teaching of technique over principle. And techniques were taught, like, you do this specific movement, this specific strike, this specific set of techniques in this specific circumstance. And the problem with that is that it just wasn't very practical. It did not form complete fighters because they would only know very specific things to do in very specific circumstances. And as you've often pointed out, because you study a lot of human behavior, and especially human behavior under stressful circumstances. And under stressful circumstances, humans behave differently than they do in normal circumstances. Maybe you could pass a test listing those techniques, you know, if you're in a classroom environment.
Like a
However,
choice bubble test.
Yeah.
A multiple choice test, but like, yeah, your brain physically changes its chemical structure if you're under stress. Like, the
such as being in a fight.
Yeah. Do you know what the technical definition of a hormone is?
I don't know if I could say the technical definition.
So like what a hormone is, because like there are a bunch of different chemicals within the body, right? But for one to be considered a hormone, it has to affect every part of the body, like not simultaneously, but it has to have an effect on every part of the body. Adrenaline is a hormone that is released under stress. Your body literally changes its physical chemical composition if you are under stress. You cannot, by like just by comparison, you cannot train for one thing not under pressure and expect to have the similar results under pressure. You're literally a different person.
Yeah, exactly.
But then you have all these like, these McDojos took the ideas of like this rote memorization technique of like teaching set technique like patterns after karate and like a lot of like Chinese martial arts who developed these techniques to teach a large group of people at the same time in wartime, right? And it's like that was designed to basically make people military combat ready and send them in, and then, you know, hopefully have less of your people killed than the other. That's completely different. That's a completely different just setting to what we have right now. Like, why would you base an entire learning structure off of an ancient technique during a time of war? That's not how that works.
Yeah.
But they completely lost that context and just said, oh, this is how it's been taught for thousands of years. Obviously that's correct, but that's not, it's a different situation. Like, we're in a different time now.
Yeah. Different time. And also war is just, I should say was, because I guess war has changed quite a bit, but war was a lot more structured, you know, than the kind of combat that the typical person learning martial arts today would be. So,
and just the reasons we went to war were completely different.
That's also true. Yeah. And yeah, geopolitics, everything has shifted, but so that's technique, right? And that's what's was popular to teach in martial arts for a long time. Still kind of is. But there's been in McDojos, but what there's big advocacy for in the martial arts world and in teaching in general more broadly now is a shift towards principle over technique, rather than teaching rote memorization and specific techniques for specific circumstances. Teaching instead the principle behind those techniques and the reason you do them and the way you navigate circumstances. Teaching principles that are universal instead of techniques, so that you can apply your knowledge in a variety of circumstances without having to think and try to access memorized routines or facts in the middle of stressful situations that's way more practical in the long run.
Yeah. Understanding critical thinking and problem solving as opposed to A to B to C.
Yeah, because when you think specifically of the martial arts application, again, like you said, when you're under stress, when you're under extreme pressure, right? If you're fighting to defend yourself, you are not going to be able to access specific rote memories of whatever techniques you learn to defend against specific circumstances, let alone to like react fast enough to be able to try and apply them. It's just not going to happen. Not going to happen at any level of quality anyway. So for example, let me just give you a quick funny little example of how our brains might work, right? So let's say I gave you a completely random string of numbers, right? And I tell you to memorize them. Okay, you memorize them. That's fine. And you could repeat them however many ways you want, right? Front to back. And then I say like, okay, now give me only the odd numbers. It's like, oh, well, it's going to be a little bit different. It's like, okay, what if I tell you to only give me repeat it to me backwards, right? Or it's like, okay, you might be able to do that kind of stuff, but it takes a lot more effort. Now, what if I told you instead that those numbers were your phone number? Suddenly it's like, oh, I have context for that. And it's like, okay, then now
because I have context for that, I don't have to say, I don't have to like memorize the entire thing. I just have to kind of remember, or like your birthday or something like that, right? There's context for that. There's reasons for me to be able to pull back on that and say, oh yeah, I know all the odd numbers in my phone, in my birth date. I know I can reset my birth date backwards, but if you without that kind of context, it's just a completely random string of numbers that you have to memorize in order and recall them, right? And so being able to say, okay, let's memorize your birthday versus here's a completely random string of numbers. What we want you to do is be able to say, my birthday is based in my personal history. I know it because it's important to me personally, as opposed to something entirely separate from me as a person and just something to add to a list to recall later.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Yeah. It's not just these sets of numbers. It's knowing what those numbers mean.
Exactly.
And being like, okay, that's not just the number 4, for example. That is the month of April in the month that I was born. It's like, whoa, that recontextualizes things. So
it's like, okay, just give me all those numbers in a random order. Yeah, I can give my birthday in a random order and not miss a single number because I know those numbers front to back because it's a part of me as a person, and it's been contextualized in my being. I know why those numbers are important.
Yeah. And so, and then when it comes to martial arts, again, like when you're under pressure and when you're in a circumstance where you have to fight, that's something that, like, you're essentially reduced to base instincts and emotions at that point.
Yeah.
And at that point, you don't have time to access your reservoir of techniques. You're purely operating on principles there. But if you haven't been taught principles, then you have nothing to fall back on. It's not, it's just, you need those broad strokes of general guidelines to lead your actions. And it's the same thing with, all sorts of teaching.
Yeah. You have to be able to operate with basically your frontal cortex turned off. The part of your brain that you normally use every single day, you have to be able to operate with that off to be effective. And rote memorization is all just recollection and like higher brain functions. You have zero access to higher brain, not zero, but you have lessened access to higher brain functions under high stress. You have to be able to root that information somewhere deeper, somewhere instinctive.
Yeah. And so principles over techniques, understanding the reasons for things so that you can make informed and wise and discerning decisions versus knowing specific facts or techniques or what have you. And it's actually kind of interesting. I know another example of this in the sort of philosophy world, because like apologetics is an interesting thing. I'm interested in some Christian apologetics as well. And I remember one apologist I listened to talking about like what the recommendation of like the one book anybody who wants to get into apologetics should read is. And there are lots of books about apologetics. There are lots of books about like doing specific kinds of like, say, Christian apologetics, right? It's like, oh, here's how you refute this worldview, or here's the common arguments that they may use if they're coming at you from this worldview. And those are all well and good. But you said, I remember hearing one apologist recommend, it's like, if you could read any one book about apologetics, it's actually one that doesn't talk about any of that at all. And it's called Tactics. And it doesn't talk about, the book Tactics doesn't talk about how to refute specific arguments or worldviews. It talks about how to converse with people, right? And how to navigate like in an apologetics conversation. And it's completely about principles. And apparently it's a master class on that kind of discourse and argumentation of how to talk to people and how to ask questions and how to lead conversations in such a way that you can enter like worldview-based debates convincingly.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, that's very interesting. But it's the same thing, yeah, with all kinds of learning. It's applicable in all fields. Principles are always going to be the superior way of learning because,
yeah, absolutely.
In effect, you're not really learning anything with facts or techniques other than maybe party tricks.
You are being taught, but you're not learning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're not learning. You're not really learning anything. And
like nobody wants to be, okay, I'm not going to say nobody, but nobody wants to be a dog that can do tricks, right? It's like, oh, like sit down, roll over. It's like, food. There's no reason. There's no reason for a dog to want to sit down and roll over other than like, oh, it could be a treat. Yeah, you don't want to be able to just like do tricks on command. That's not what you should want to do.
It's not what you should want. Yeah, for sure. You should just like have some dignity for yourself.
Have some dignity.
Okay, well, that went in all sorts of directions I wasn't expecting, but we should probably wind this conversation down for a close.
I feel like there was 3 different podcast recordings in there somewhere.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But thank you all very much for listening. This has been the Hypercube podcast. This show is edited by Loryn Pacheco, mixed by Raphael Pacheco, with original theme music by Mono Memory. Until next time, we'll see y'all later. God bless.
Adios, amigos.